Well, hello everyone. This is Ahmad Mansour with SPR. Thank you for joining Day 3 of the Expanding Business Engagement Virtual Learning Series. Today's focus will be on social media, using social media for engagement. And we just have another great day of presentations. And just like yesterday and the day before, this it's kind of an accumulation of great presentations and activities from our subject matter experts, your colleagues, and peers. So we're really excited about ending this week with this dynamic presentation on social media. I think you'll really like it. But before we get started, let's hear from Jonathan with DOL. Okay.
Sorry, this is Jen Pertle. I think Jonathan is restarting his computer. He got kicked off for some reason. So
okay.
I'll just go ahead and, this is Jennifer Pertle with Department of Labor. We just want to welcome you to the social media presentation today, and we're looking forward to the discussion. So take it away.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. So, we've gone over this many times, but just in case that you've invited others onto today's web event, just would like to quickly go over the mechanics and instructions for using the chat. So once again, today there's no polls, so we'll just use the chat. And if you would like to chat, type your questions into the text box, and then hit enter, and then click return. Easy as that. So just be sure that you actually do hit return, or you will see your message, but not the rest of us. And if you would like to send your message to the presenter only or to other participants, click on the drop-down arrow and choose your intended recipient. If you do not select a recipient, the message will be sent to everyone. So thank you, and let's get started. One more thing. We've been very successful in avoiding the fire drill. And so we would like to do the same today. So we just would like to remind everyone to make sure to mute your phones at all times unless you're speaking, deactivate the microphones on all devices, and avoid using any third-party applications that's connected to your computer or to your phone that may be connected to your computer. So, with that said, let's get started. And here's our agenda here. So, let's do an overview of today's event. This is day 3 of the virtual learning series with social media. We have Spencer Critchley, who's with Boots Road, that will be presenting on social media that works. And then we'll take a break and do a real quick exercise, team exercise. And then Spencer will come back and provide us with some examples of how to use social media in business engagement. And then we'll take some Q&A, some questions and answers, and then we'll have some closing remarks. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kristen.
Hi, everybody. So glad you're back, and it's been a crazy week. I know you spent a lot of time with us. Thanks so much. We're so glad to see you all back today. And here's our usual roadmap. So we'll spend some time today learning about the changing media landscape and how we can use it more effectively. And our partner at Boots Road, Spencer Critchley, will share some of his wisdom and engage us in some hands-on trying out of new tools. So we can't wait for that. We'll be together a little longer today, about 2.5 hours, because it's our last session of the learning series. And after this week, we're already missing not chatting with you every day. And then in a couple of weeks, we'll meet again as a group for the last time and go over all the resources that we've collectively developed over the course of the project and figure out how to apply them going forward. So just a couple of reminders and tips before we get started. Firstly, we're going to watch a 30-second video in the middle of the presentation, but we're going to try a different approach than yesterday. Today, we're going to paste the link in the chat box on the left, and when you click there, you'll be launched into another window or another tab in your browser, and you can watch it there and then come right back in the window and we'll resume. We tested it a bunch this morning, and none of us got kicked out, so we think that that'll work just fine. It's a very brief video, and I think you'll laugh a little bit. We'll also, in the middle of the session, we'll have a 30-minute break during which there'll be sort of a thinking assignment. So just like on Wednesday, if you're alone in your office, then give your fellow team members a call and talk about the assignment and how to approach it. And if you're all in the same room, go ahead and grab a cup of coffee and have a chat. So it won't take the whole 30 minutes. You'll also have time to check your email or voicemail. So that's what we'll do in the middle of the session. If you've not had a chance to invite other colleagues who don't normally join you or who are just around the office and would benefit from this session, you can still do so now, or you can do so at break. And after the break, we're going to be reviewing real examples of workforce professionals, including some of you, using social media effectively. And then finally, in the next week or so, Sam will be doing a final push to gather the tools for the toolkit and the website. And I know we've said this before, but drafts are good. We love drafts. So that's all, and let's go ahead and get started. I'm going to turn the floor over to Ahmad to introduce Spencer. Thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, Kristen. So we have here with us today Spencer Critchley, who's the managing partner at the Boots Roads Group. And his specialty is around communications and collaborative engagement. We're really excited about having Spencer with us today because we work with Spencer a lot. He's a partner on a lot of projects that we've worked on here at SPR, and we know it's worked very well. I know that Spencer, we heard him yesterday. He was very excited about coming here today and presenting. He even gave us a warning saying that he gets so excited about this to remind him if he goes over. So I know that there's this enthusiasm that he's ready to share with you all today. So with that, Spencer, I want to thank you for being here today, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Ahmad, and thanks for joining us this morning, everybody. And I'll try to control myself, but keep an eye on the clock and let me know if you need to rein me in. We've got a lot to cover today, so I'm going to just charge right ahead. And first of all, I'm going to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about during the course of my session. The first part, before the break, is going to be broken into three major chunks. First of all, I'm going to talk about how influential communication works. And by that, I mean communication that actually affects people's beliefs and behavior. That's different from the kind of communication we normally think about as just sharing information. Then I'm going to take off from that into how social media works, building on what we learned in part one. And then building on that, I'll give you the elements of how you build a social media strategy that will actually be effective. Just before the break, I'll give you a homework assignment and ask you to go away for about 20 minutes and think about how you might be able to apply what we've been talking about in your own work. Then when we come back for part four, I'll ask you how your homework went, and then spend part two of the overall presentation talking about engagement, which is really a critical activity in social media. I'll be showing you some of the tools I used to come up with engagement examples for you today and show you those actual examples and show you how they're working in your world. So let's move ahead. First of all, part one, how influence works. I want to start by asking you to compare a series of A's and B's. So first of all, this is A. Just look at that for a moment, please. And this is B. And this is A. And this is D. Kind of like getting your eyes tested, I guess. And this is A. And this is B. Now, what is the difference between the A's and the B's? First of all, at the top of column A, we see the Surgeon General's warning from cigarette packages. And across from it, we see the Marlboro Man. And then below the Surgeon General's warning, we see some bok choy. And next to that, we see a hamburger. And then we see a meeting. And then we see the crowd at a Jay-Z concert. What's the difference between the A's and the B's? And I'd actually like to invite you, while I'm asking that question, if anybody would like to suggest. I see some people are already making suggestions. I'll just give you a minute to think about this. I see one person is saying that it's boring versus excitement, which I think is pretty close. I will say that I was present at the meeting at the lower left. It was about a very important subject, and people really were engaged. We were talking about reducing gang violence, but you can see that the kind of involvement at a typical meeting is very different from the kind of involvement you see at pop concerts. Okay, so we also see that somebody is saying rational versus emotional. And I think that we've pretty much got it. So let me move on to my next slide and say, yeah, I think that column A is information and column B is emotion. And first of all, I also want to pause for a moment and make sure, can everybody hear me okay? If you can't hear me, I'll try to adjust that while I'm talking. Now, the thing is that when you compare information and emotion, the impact on it is very, very different. And let me start with the cigarette warning example. When the Surgeon General found back in the 60s that cigarette smoking was extremely dangerous for your health, they required the cigarette manufacturers, of course, to put this warning on the cigarette packages. And I can imagine that the cigarette manufacturers at the time were probably not at all frightened by this instruction. They knew that this text warning about the information that clearly demonstrated the very serious dangers of cigarette smoking could not possibly compete with something like the Marlboro Man. And in fact, it's been found that when you put these cigarette warnings on packages, it can actually lead to an increase in smoking, at least among people who are already addicted to nicotine, because what happens is they see the mention of smoking and it just reminds them, boy, I could really use a cigarette right now. And by contrast, if you show people images of the Marlboro Man, this is essentially somebody that many people either want to be or they want to date. And it's appealing to you on a deep, powerful, emotional level. There are all kinds of emotional archetypes bundled up in the Marlboro Man about freedom and masculinity and all kinds of things. And it's just far more powerful in influencing our actual beliefs and behaviors. In fact, if you doubt the power of this kind of thing, you might be surprised to learn that Marlboro was originally a ladies' cigarette brand. So that if you mention Marlboro up until the 1950s, it would be similar to mentioning Virginia Slims. People associated it with women smokers. And Philip Morris back then decided they wanted to rebrand it. So they came up with this whole new brand identity of the Marlboro Man and were able to completely change people's feelings about this brand and turn it into the ultimate macho brand of cigarettes. So similarly, we see that with healthy vegetables versus fast food hamburgers. The information about the way we should all be eating is freely available, and it's very persuasive. We can eat as many fresh vegetables as we want, and it's nothing but good for us. And, you know, eating too many hamburgers is definitely not that good for you. And yet, the emotional appeal of a hamburger, at least for many people, especially when combined with advertising, is almost overwhelming. And just by showing you this image of a hamburger, if we were approaching lunchtime, I'd be able to, where you are, I'd be able to predict that many of you would be, in fact, having a hamburger for lunch just by being exposed to this image. And then at meetings versus hip-hop concerts and rock concerts, it's the same thing. The people who are present at the average meeting will probably have a hard time remembering what was said at that meeting a week later, even if it was a very important subject and they were genuinely engaged with it. But if you go to a really great concert, you might very well remember that event for the rest of your life. So one more comparison, and this is where we want to send you away to the web for just a moment. Compare the impact of these two things. First of all, if I tell you, please don't litter, it's ugly and it's bad for the environment, and compare that to going away to our web link. And let's click through to that link now and have a look at this example.
We're popping the link in the window momentarily.
Okay, so has everybody had a chance to look at the video? I'm just giving folks a moment. Yeah, and it looks like we can move ahead. I think everybody's had a chance to look. So this is one of the most famous public service announcement or PSA campaigns in history, and also one of the most effective. In fact, I believe this campaign is still running. And of course, it's the famous "Don't Mess with Texas" campaign. Now, in Texas, they had this littering problem, like most places in the United States, and it had been going on for decades. And they tried all the usual information-based approaches. If you think about littering, the case against it is pretty obvious. As I said in my text slide before this one, it's ugly and it's bad for the environment. You know, what's to argue with? And so they would try repeatedly to make the entirely rational case that you really should not litter, and come on, everybody, let's stop littering. And what would tend to happen is that either nothing would happen, or in fact, littering would get worse. Because if you ask yourself the question, how much do Texans like to be told what to do, especially if they think they're being told what to do by the government, the answer is not very much. And in fact, what would often happen is that they'd hear these PSAs about please don't litter, you know, it's ugly and it's bad for the environment, and in fact, they would assert their Texan independence by throwing even more litter out the window as they're driving down the highway. So that's the information-based approach. It did not have any effect on people's beliefs or behaviors, and that's the key to influential communication. You want to affect what people believe, and you want to affect what how they behave. And it just turns out that information does not have very much effect on our beliefs and behaviors, much as we might like to think that it does. So what does work is to identify what are the emotional drivers for a particular population? And in this population of Texans, it kind of looked like, gee whiz, do they not care about their state? They're messing it up like this? And no, not at all. In fact, as you probably know, Texans are really fierce about their love of the state of Texas. They also have a great deal of admiration for certain kinds of Texans. For example, members of the Dallas Cowboys. And these are a couple of Dallas Cowboys players from some years back now. So the very clever ad agency that was hired to do these PSA campaigns realized that it was not going to be the information that was going to change beliefs and behavior. It was going to be emotion, and in particular, the right kind of emotional drivers for this particular population. So they came up with the idea of getting iconic Texas figures like these Dallas Cowboys players and having them identify the act of littering with disrespect for the great state of Texas, and tying it into the tremendous macho appeal of these football players. And you can see that the effect of that is very, very different. And this broke through. Suddenly, littering in Texas plummeted. And as they continued the campaign with other iconic Texas figures like Willie Nelson, for example, and Jerry Jeff Walker and the country star George Strait, they continue to see this kind of success. And in fact, now this campaign has become so popular that I saw a contest online the other day about inviting people to vote for their favorite Don't Mess with Texas PSA. And they sell the Don't Mess with Texas t-shirts, but you've probably seen all of that. So, from the rational side, it makes no sense. If you watch these PSAs, there's almost no information about why you shouldn't litter. It's all an emotional appeal, and it all ends up being remembered and having an influence on people's beliefs and behavior. So now let's ask ourselves, why is emotion so dominant? And, there's a lot of reasons that people will come up with, and one of the most popular ones is, gosh, people are just stupid. They're led around by their emotions, and most people can't think straight. And when that opinion is offered, usually the speaker is accepting him or herself, because I, of course, am one of the few, perspicacious members of the cognoscenti, and I, of course, am correct in my opinions, and I base my opinions on clear facts and logic, and that's why I think what I think, but it's all those other idiots who are victims of their emotions. But in fact, research clearly shows that all of us are influenced by our emotions to this extent. When it comes down to it, when we decide whether we're going to do one thing or another, it ends up being largely emotionally driven, no matter how rationally we think we're behaving. And I believe the reason for that ultimately is survival. If you think about our primordial state before we're living in cities, before we're using technology to protect ourselves against nature, it's an absolute survival skill to instantly be able to decide whether something is an opportunity or a threat. So if you picture yourself out in the wild and you encounter a lioness, you don't have any time to think about it. You don't have any time to consult opinions about lions and their behavior. You have to make an instantaneous decision about whether you're going to continue approaching or whether you're going to flee. And that's true whether you're facing a threat, and it's true whether you're facing an opportunity, whether you're the one who's going to be eaten or you're the one who's going to do the eating. It's an absolute survival necessity. And our intellectual minds are way too slow to make decisions like this. You've probably had the experience many times in your life when you need to react instantaneously if you see that your child is in danger, or you're narrowly avoiding being hit by a car, or you notice somebody who you think is attractive. These kinds of things happen instantaneously, and very often your response is underway before your conscious mind is even aware of the initial stimulus. So our emotions are entirely capable of taking over our consciousness because it's wired into us as a survival skill. So that's point number one about why emotion is so dominant. Point number two is more recent research shows that actually the emotional faculty is the decision-making faculty. It's actually, if you think about computer processing, it's the chip inside our head that's dedicated to making decisions. Just like in computers, some chips are devoted to graphics and others are devoted to doing math operations and handling text. In our heads, in effect, we have a chip in there designed for making emotions, and that's the emotion, for making decisions, and that's the emotional faculty that does that. There's a researcher named Antonio Damasio who published this book called Descartes' Error, and he refers to research about people who have suffered a certain kind of brain damage that actually prevents them from experiencing emotions. They're entirely fine every other way.